When Derek and his crew first saw Marcus Steele, a black pilot running a small charter business out of a rural airstrip, they saw an easy mark, a man they could intimidate, use, and discard. He was alone, outnumbered, and flying the kind of plane they needed for their smuggling runs. To them, he was just another civilian who would fold under pressure. What they didn't see was the soldier beneath the surface, a former Air Force pilot with combat scars and nerves forged under enemy fire. When they hijacked his plane and left him for dead, they thought the job was done. But Marcus wasn't the kind of man to stay down. By the time he came back for what was his, Derek and his men would learn the hard way that they had picked the wrong pilot to cross. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe. Marcus Steele ran his hand across the smooth surface of the Cessna Citation's wing, feeling the cool metal beneath his fingertips. The early morning sun cut through the thin haze over the regional airstrip, casting long shadows on the tarmac. The faint hum of distant engines mixed with the chirping of birds waking with the day. This was his ritual. Pre-flight checks done with military precision, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Flying wasn't just his job. It was his freedom, his sanctuary. Every bolt he touched, every panel he examined reminded him that up there, in the sky, he was untouchable. Down here, well, down here was different. Oil's looking clean. Nothing's dripping, Chloe Ramirez called from under the nose wheel, her voice carrying over the quiet hum of the airstrip. She slid out from beneath the plane, wiping grease from her hands onto a rag tucked into her coveralls. Her dark hair was tied back in a loose braid, strands escaping to frame her face. She was already smirking, knowing Marcus would double-check her work anyway. "Gotta keep you honest," Marcus shot back, his tone warm but firm. He trusted Chloe, more than most, but old habits from his Air Force days didn't die easily. He liked things done his way, the right way. She understood that. She respected it. Their banter was comfortable, familiar, the kind born from years of relying on each other. She knew engines. He knew the skies. Together, they kept his small charter business afloat, barely. Each flight was another chance to stay airborne, another step toward keeping his dream alive. They were a team. Out here, trust was everything. Marcus was securing the cargo hatch when he spotted the passengers approaching. 4 men, all mid-30s to early 40s, dressed casually but with a certain stiffness that set them apart. Their steps were heavy, their eyes sharp and scanning. They moved like men used to taking up space and expecting others to get out of their way. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a cold stare and a faded scar along his jawline, made eye contact with Marcus. No smile, no pleasantries, just a slow nod, the kind that felt more like a warning than a greeting. Marcus's gut tightened. Years of combat flying had honed his instincts. Something was off. He couldn't place it exactly, but it was there, like a faint crackle in the air before a storm. Clients were clients, though. He'd flown all sorts over the years. Businessmen, celebrities, a few who were likely smugglers. So he pushed the unease aside. This was just another job. "You taking this one up solo?" Chloe asked, noticing the subtle shift in Marcus's posture. She knew him well enough to pick up on the tension coiling in his shoulders. "Yeah, shouldn't be more than a couple of hours," he said, keeping his voice steady, professional. But as the men boarded, their eyes lingered on the cockpit controls a beat too long, like they were sizing it up, memorizing it. That tight knot in Marcus's stomach pulled a little harder. He couldn't shake the feeling. This flight would be different. He climbed into the pilot's seat, fingers tightening around the yoke, feeling the familiar grooves beneath his palms. Routine, he reminded himself. He had done this 1,000 times before, but his instincts whispered otherwise, that old pilot sense warning him like a low-altitude alarm. The steady hum of the engines filled the cabin as the Cessna Citation climbed through the cloud cover, leveling off into a smooth cruise. Marcus adjusted the controls with practiced ease, his eyes flicking between the instrument panel and the endless stretch of sky ahead. Up here, he was in his element, where the ground was far below, and every decision was his alone. But the cabin behind him felt heavier than it should. The cockpit was semi-open, separated only by a short partition and a thin curtain left partially drawn back. He felt Derek's eyes on him from the first-row seat. That scar-jawed stare burned into the back of his neck. An hour into the flight, Derek leaned forward, his head breaching the partition. Smooth ride. You fly like someone who's done this a long time. Marcus kept his eyes ahead. I've had my share of hours, Derek pressed. Casual, but weighted. We like a man who knows his way around the skies. Reliable. Quiet. Marcus glanced back, catching Derek's smirk. He didn't like where this was going. I'm just a pilot, Marcus said. His tone cool, controlled, the kind of voice he'd perfected in the cockpit and the military. The voice that kept everything steady, no matter the turbulence inside. No one's just anything, Derek countered, leaning in a little more, his voice edged with something that made it clear this wasn't just idle talk. It was a probe, a test. From his seat, Terrell shifted, his knee bouncing with restless energy. He looked like the type who didn't like sitting still for long. Marcus clocked it. Nerves or impatience? Maybe both. Raymond, broad-shouldered and quiet, sat still but alert. His eyes moved every few seconds, cutting over to check on his crew, scanning like a man used to watching his surroundings. Muscle, the kind who didn't need to say much. Derek lowered his voice, just enough to make it feel personal, like this was no longer about the flight. It was about Marcus. See, Marcus, guys like us, we got plans, big ones. Big plans need transport, discreet, reliable, a man who knows when to ask questions and when not to. Marcus felt the heat rising beneath his collar, but he kept his face like stone. He knew how to hold a line. I'm not in that business. Raymond grunted from the back, low and gravelly. Same thing, depending on who's paying. Marcus exhaled slowly, adjusting the altitude with the ease of experience. But his mind was racing. He needed control, not just of the plane, but of the situation. He wouldn't let them box him in, wouldn't let them pull him into something that could cost him everything. I don't take jobs off the books, Marcus said firmly. FAA's strict. License is my livelihood. Derek's tone cooled, his words deliberate. Licenses can be replaced. Lives can't. The words slithered into Marcus's ears like a slow, creeping threat. He turned slightly, meeting Derek's eyes, holding his gaze just long enough to send his own message. He wasn't rattled, not yet. You hired me for a flight, Marcus said, voice low and steady. That's what you're getting. A long pause. The air felt thin, like the oxygen wasn't quite reaching. Then Derek leaned back, wearing a shallow grin that didn't touch his eyes. Relax. We're just talking. Friendly conversation. But there was nothing friendly about the way Tyrell cracked his knuckles, the sharp pops punctuating the silence, or the way Raymond's hand rested just a little too close to his waist, like he wanted Marcus to see it. Marcus faced forward again, his heart beating harder against his ribs. He ran the numbers in his head. Nearest airstrip? Emergency landing options? How far would these men go? The sky stretched wide ahead, but inside that plane, it felt like the walls were closing in. He had a feeling this flight was only just beginning. The hum of the engines held steady, but Marcus Steele could sense the cabin behind him shifting. Something had changed. The quiet tension had curdled into something sharper, something ready to break. He didn't need to turn around to know that the men were moving differently. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. A footstep here. A hand brushing against a wall there. It was subtle, but unmistakable, like the faint crackle before a storm. They were positioning themselves, not in a hurry, but with the kind of quiet precision that only came from experience. Marcus tightened his grip on the yoke, his knuckles whitening slightly. His mind raced ahead, calculating. He was trained for emergencies, fire, engine failure, turbulence. But this was different. This was human. This was a slow, hostile takeover, playing out 30,000 feet in the air, where his margin for error was razor thin. Then, Derek made his move. Marcus felt the presence behind him before he saw it. An instinct honed from years of flying combat missions where even the smallest shift in the air could mean life or death. Derek was standing now. No more pretense, no more small talk. He stepped halfway into the cockpit, his broad frame filling the tight space. This time, there was no smirk, no forced friendliness. His face was flat, cold, and the scar along his jaw seemed deeper under the harsh cabin light. "We need to talk," Derek said. His voice was quieter than Marcus expected, but it carried weight. Heavy. Final. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He flicked his eyes over the instruments, making a show of focusing on the dials and gauges, buying himself precious seconds. He knew this was it. Derek's hand landed on the back of Marcus's seat, firm. Not a grip, but a claim, a warning. "You're going to change course," Derek continued, his tone hardening. "Now." Marcus kept his gaze forward, his jaw tight. "This flight has a filed route. I'm not—" "You're going to change course," Derek repeated, slower this time, each word sinking in like a weight. "Because this plane, it's ours now." The words landed like a hammer. But Marcus didn't flinch. He breathed in slowly through his nose, his chest rising in steady control. He was trained for this, trained to stay calm when everything went wrong, but his pulse quickened, hammering beneath his ribs. "Think carefully," Marcus said, his voice even, his hands steady on the controls. "You don't know what you're doing. Up here, there's no second chances." Derek leaned in closer, his breath brushing against Marcus's ear. "We're done talking." A shift in weight behind them, a cue. Marcus didn't turn, but he felt it. Tyrell and Raymond were ready. The cabin had gone silent, but the tension was loud, crackling like an electric current. Marcus's eyes stayed on the sky ahead, but his mind shifted into survival mode. Every decision from this point forward could mean life or death. Tyrell moved next. Marcus caught his reflection in the windshield, rising from his seat, stepping forward, fast and aggressive. There was no hesitation, no more subtle posturing. This was force now. Before Marcus could react, Tyrell was shoving past Derek, cramming himself into the already tight cockpit. His elbow rammed hard into Marcus's shoulder, driving him against the side panel. The plane jolted, slight but noticeable, the kind of shift only a trained pilot would catch. Marcus's instincts took over, his hand automatically adjusting the trim to stabilize their altitude. But Tyrell's knee pressed into his thigh, locking down his leg, restricting his range of movement. The cockpit was too small for this kind of struggle. Marcus couldn't maneuver. He was boxed in, caged with nowhere to go. "Get off me!" Marcus barked, his voice sharper than he intended. It was the edge of his military discipline breaking through, the tone of a man used to being in command. "Do what he said!" Tyrell snapped, his hand gripping the back of Marcus's headrest with white-knuckled tension, like he was ready to rip it off the seat. His breath was hot, his energy coiled and ready to explode. Raymond had moved, too. He was in the aisle now, his bulk filling the narrow space, blocking any view from the rear of the cabin. They had cut Marcus off, sealing him into the cockpit. Marcus's heart slammed against his ribs, adrenaline coursing, but his hands remained steady on the controls. That was his training. Control under pressure. "You're going to crash this plane if you keep this up," Marcus warned, his voice low but laced with anger, every syllable deliberate. He needed to anchor them in reality. The cockpit was no place for emotion. Derek's eyes didn't waver. The scar along his jaw seemed to tighten with his jawline. "Change the course. Now!" Marcus's mind worked fast. He could fight. But up here, that was suicide. Losing control at this altitude could kill them all. He needed to de-escalate. He needed control of the plane and the situation. "I'll adjust the flight path," Marcus said, voice measured, calculated. "But you need to let me fly. You crowd this cockpit, and we all go into the ground." Derek stared him down, tension stretching every second. Then he gave a small nod. Barely perceptible, but enough, a signal. Tyrell hesitated, his jaw tight, but he followed the cue. He backed off, but the aggression in his eyes didn't fade. He was ready to go again at the slightest provocation. Marcus adjusted the course slightly, just enough to suggest compliance. A few degrees off course, nothing drastic. He would not hand them his plane, but the line had been crossed. They weren't just pressuring him now. This was force. This was something else. This wasn't coercion anymore. This was hijacking. Minutes passed in tense silence, each second stretched, thick with pressure, the low hum of the engines the only sound. Then, from behind, Tyrell again. He lunged without warning, his hand clamped onto Marcus's arm, fingers digging in hard, yanking with brute force, trying to wrench him out of the pilot's seat. Marcus twisted instinctively, driving his elbow back into Tyrell's ribs, but the tight space worked against him. There was no room to fight properly. Derek shoved forward, adding his weight to the struggle. His shoulder jammed into Marcus's back, pinning him against the console. The yoke jerked sideways under the pressure. The plane banked, hard. The cabin lurched violently to the left. Loose items clattered to the floor with metallic thuds. A coffee cup tipped, rolling into the aisle. Overhead compartments rattled. Warning chimes blared. A sharp, urgent beep cutting through the chaos. "Hold it steady!" Raymond shouted from the aisle, his calm exterior finally cracking, voice edged with panic. Marcus fought to regain control, his left hand straining against the yoke, muscles burning as he tried to level the plane. His right arm was still grappling with Tyrell's grip, fending off the man's strength. He planted his feet firmly against the cockpit floor, bracing his body, pushing back with every ounce of his strength. His breath was short, heart pounding like a drum against his chest. He couldn't let go. Not even for a second. For a brief second, he thought he might win. He felt Tyrell's grip slipping, his own leverage improving. But then, Derek moved again. A blur of motion. Derek's arm looped around Marcus's throat, forearm tightening like a steel bar, locking him in a chokehold. "Enough!" Derek roared, his voice shaking the confined cockpit. Marcus's throat constricted, his air supply cut short. His vision blurred, dots dancing at the edges of his sight. But his hand, his pilot's hand, slammed against the stabilizer trim with precision born of instinct. The plane leveled. Barely. The violent banking eased. The engines held steady. The chimes faded, though the threat still lingered in every inch of pressurized air. Finally, Derek released him. Just enough to let him breathe. Marcus gasped, air searing his lungs. His neck ached, his body trembling with adrenaline, but his grip stayed firm on the controls. The plane was stable, but he had lost more than his breath. He had lost control, but only for a moment. The weight of that fact settled heavy in his chest. Though his grip on the yoke remained firm, his throat ached from Derek's chokehold. Every breath a reminder of just how close he had come to blacking out. His body screamed for rest, but his mind was sharper than ever. Instincts from years in the Air Force firing on all cylinders. Derek leaned in close, his breath hot against Marcus's ear, his voice a low, guttural growl. "You fly where we tell you, or we all die." The words were not a threat. They were a promise. Marcus coughed, his airway still raw, but he gave a small nod. It was all they needed to see. Let them think they had won. Let them believe they had broken him. Rage simmered beneath his calm exterior, but he buried it deep. Anger was dangerous up here. It clouded judgment. He couldn't afford that. Not with lives on the line, including his own. The engines droned on, their familiar hum usually a source of comfort. Now, it was a background noise to a different kind of battle. They had the numbers, but Marcus Steele still had his mind. Derek had stepped back into the cabin, but his presence loomed large over the cockpit, a shadow that refused to recede. He didn't bother returning to his seat like the others. Instead, he stood near the thin curtain separating the cockpit from the passenger area, his arms folded across his chest, his sharp eyes flicking between Marcus and his crew. He was watching for weakness, waiting for it. Tyrell sat just behind Derek, still breathing hard from their struggle in the cockpit. His knee bounced again, that restless energy returning in full force. But it was different now. Sharper, more dangerous. It wasn't just impatience. It was a fuse waiting for the next spark. Marcus knew men like him, hot-blooded, quick to ignite, quick to pull a trigger. Further back, Raymond remained seated, but his stillness was deceptive. His eyes scanned every corner of the cabin, his calm masking something more dangerous. Calculation. He was the one to worry about. Tyrell was the fire. But Raymond was the mind, the planner. He'd be the one pulling strings when it mattered most. The cabin had transformed into their battlefield. Every movement was a maneuver. Every glance, a signal. Marcus knew he was outnumbered, but he wasn't out yet. He adjusted the heading slightly, the motion smooth, controlled, just enough to show he was cooperating. At least, that's what he wanted them to believe, but his mind was already ahead. He needed to get this plane down before they forced his hand, before they made him take them somewhere worse, somewhere remote, where there'd be no air traffic, no witnesses, just him and a gun to his head. He could see it, clear as day. The thought was cold, but it was real. He couldn't let it come to that. "We're coming up on some turbulence," Marcus said, his voice even, professional. A pilot's voice. It was a lie, but a necessary one. Turbulence was the perfect excuse. It could justify sudden changes, rough maneuvers, anything. It gave him room to work. Derek's eyes narrowed, suspicion flashing across his face. "You trying something?" Marcus didn't look away from the horizon. "You want this plane in one piece, don't you? We drop into rough air like this, and I lose control. We all go down." Derek's gaze flicked to Raymond, who gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was enough. "Fine," Derek said, his tone edged with warning. "But no funny business." Marcus nodded, making a subtle adjustment to their descent. It looked like turbulence avoidance. But it was anything but. He was lining up with an emergency airstrip he remembered from his Air Force days. A rough, forgotten patch of runway tucked into a remote valley. It wasn't on any commercial maps, but Marcus knew it. It had saved his life once. Maybe it would again. Minutes stretched into eternity. Marcus eased back the throttle, making their descent feel gradual, natural. His heart pounded, but his hands stayed steady. The strip came into view. Hidden, narrow, but there. "What is this?" Tyrell's voice cut through the tension like a knife, clearing the turbulence. Marcus said smoothly, his knuckles white on the yoke. "Safer, at lower altitude." Derek wasn't convinced. His eyes narrowed, suspicion tightening his features as he stepped into the cockpit again, his body filling the narrow space. His hand drifted near his waist. There, always hovering, always close to the weapon Marcus knew was tucked beneath his jacket. That hand had become a symbol, a warning. It was never far from control, never far from violence. Marcus tensed, his muscles coiled beneath the surface, but he forced his voice to stay steady. He had to sound like the professional, like the pilot who had everything under control. "You want this plane, right? You want to fly it again? You let me do this properly." Every word was deliberate, designed to appeal to Derek's need for power, his desire to walk away with the plane intact. Derek stared him down, the tension crackling in the confined cockpit. He was measuring the risk, calculating whether Marcus was bluffing. Seconds stretched. But then, finally, Derek stepped back into the cabin. It was a retreat, but not a surrender. Marcus seized his chance, his mind locking into the precision of landing procedures. He aligned with the strip, short, uneven, barely fit for a jet like this. But it was his best and only option. His fingers moved quickly, cutting the throttle further, guiding the descent with experience honed in far worse conditions. The nose dropped sharply. The descent was steeper than the men expected. Tyrell cursed under his breath, his voice sharp with panic. He wasn't used to feeling helpless. "What the hell are you doing?" Derek's voice snapped through the cabin, colder now, but laced with that edge of fear no one liked to admit. "Landing!" Marcus shot back, his tone clipped but controlled. "Unless you'd rather crash." There was no room for argument. This was survival now. The wheels slammed into the uneven ground, too hard. The jarring impact rattled through the fuselage, the entire plane jolting violently. Marcus gritted his teeth, holding firm. The tires skidded, bouncing once before catching traction. Gravel and debris spat from beneath them as the engines roared in reverse thrust. The plane skidded forward, the tree line rushing toward them. Closer, too close. Marcus kept his grip, every muscle focused, until finally they stopped. The nose just short of the trees. Silence followed. For a brief moment, nothing but the ticking of the cooling engines filled the cabin. Then Tyrell shot to his feet, his face flushed with rage, his voice breaking. "You think we're stupid? Where the hell are we?" His knuckles whitened against the seat back, veins rising along his forearm. Marcus raised his hands slowly, palms open, non-threatening. "I saved your damn lives. This is an emergency strip. You wanted to take this plane somewhere. It's still in one piece because of me." His voice was calm but firm, asserting his value without defiance. Derek stepped forward, slower, controlled. He didn't erupt like Tyrell. He was colder, deadlier. His eyes swept the clearing, jagged hills, dense forest, no roads, no help, just isolation, perfect for them. Marcus realized his mistake too late. He had thought that grounding the plane would give him control, that putting them on solid ground would level the playing field. Up in the air, the risk of a crash had been his leverage. Down here, he believed he could stall them, maybe even find an opening to regain the upper hand. But now, as the engines wound down and the trees loomed around them, he saw the truth with crystal clarity. All he had done was hand Derek exactly what he needed: privacy. Derek's lips curled into a slow, deliberate smile. It wasn't the smirk of a man who had won a hand. It was the smile of someone who had taken the whole game. "You're right," he said, voice low and satisfied. "You did save it. And now it's ours." Marcus barely had time to react before Tyrell's hand clamped onto his collar, the grip rough and unrelenting. He yanked Marcus from the pilot's seat with the kind of force that came from pent-up rage. Marcus twisted, trying to resist, but Raymond was already moving in, silent, methodical, strong. His hands locked onto Marcus's arm with a precision that made it clear this wasn't the first time he'd restrained someone. Together, they dragged him down the narrow aisle, his boots scraping against the floor as he strained to plant his feet. Rows of empty seats blurred past him, each step a struggle, but he was outmatched. They hauled him down the steps onto the gravel strip below. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. But Marcus barely noticed. His chest heaved from the exertion, his muscles tense and ready for whatever came next. He stumbled as Tyrell gave him another hard shove, his boots grinding into the gravel. Derek followed close behind, his calm composure making it all worse. He wasn't angry. He wasn't hurried. He stood at the base of the stairs like a man inspecting his new property. "You did good," Derek said, his eyes drifting back to the plane, taking in the sleek lines and sturdy frame like it was his prize. "But we don't need you anymore." Marcus tensed, bracing himself. He expected to feel the cold press of a gun barrel against his ribs, or the sharp flash of a knife across his side. He prepared for pain, for the inevitable violence. But Derek wasn't in any rush. He didn't need to be. He had the plane. He had the power. Instead, he raised a hand and gestured toward the woods, the dark, dense forest stretching beyond the clearing. "Walk." Marcus met his gaze, refusing to show fear. His jaw tightened, his eyes hard. "You leave me out here. I'll find you. I'll take it back." Derek's smile stayed fixed, amused, as though he had already calculated the odds. "We'll see." Tyrell didn't wait. He gave one last shove, sending Marcus stumbling toward the trees, alone. The engines rumbled back to life behind him, a low, familiar growl that had once meant freedom, but now felt like a knife twisting in his gut. Marcus turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he watched his plane, begin to roll down the rough strip. Gravel and dust kicked up in its wake, the sound swelling as the jet gained speed. The nose lifted, and the sleek body cut through the air, climbing into the sky with practiced grace. His freedom, his livelihood, was slipping away, stolen by men who had no right to it. Marcus stood motionless, his gaze locked on the shrinking silhouette as it disappeared into the pale afternoon sky. The engine's roar faded into a distant hum before melting into the wind that whispered through the trees. Then came the silence, a suffocating kind of quiet that pressed in from all sides. His chest rose and fell with slow, measured breaths. His jaw tightened, teeth grinding together. But he resisted the impulse to yell or curse into the empty clearing. He had learned a long time ago that panic was a luxury men like him couldn't afford. Back in the Air Force, during those long deployments in hostile zones, they had a name for this moment: the snap. The instant when everything you thought was under control is torn from you, leaving you bare, vulnerable. What mattered wasn't the fall. It was what you did after you hit the ground. Marcus knew this. He had lived it before. His instincts were already taking over. Survival first. Then the fight. He let his eyes sweep across the clearing, cataloging everything. The dense forest pressed in around the rough landing strip, its branches clawing at the sky. The ground beneath him was uneven, scattered with jagged stones and fallen branches. There were no roads, no tire tracks, no sign that anyone had been here in years. That made sense. Derek and his men had wanted privacy, isolation. They had found it. Marcus adjusted his collar, his fingers brushing over the tender skin of his neck, still sore from Tyrell's chokehold. His shoulder throbbed from being slammed into the cockpit panel, and his ribs ached from the struggle. He welcomed the pain. It was proof he was still here, still in the fight. Derek had made one mistake. He'd left Marcus breathing. And Marcus Steele never quit. He started moving, his boots crunching over the uneven ground with each determined step. The rough terrain tested his balance, but he pushed forward without hesitation. He headed toward the tree line, ducking beneath low branches and forcing his way through thick underbrush. The cold air bit at his exposed skin, stinging his cheeks and stiffening his fingers, but he welcomed the discomfort. It kept him alert, reminded him he was still alive. He didn't slow down. He couldn't. He needed distance from the strip. Derek might have been satisfied leaving him in the forest, but Marcus knew better. Men like Derek didn't trust loose ends. He could already imagine the plane circling back, Tyrell eager to put a bullet in him. Marcus refused to give them that satisfaction. It took nearly an hour before he reached higher ground. His legs burned with fatigue, but he kept climbing, using his hands to grip jagged rocks and haul himself upward. His breathing grew heavier, his chest rising and falling in deep, measured gulps. But he didn't stop. When he finally reached the top of the rocky outcrop, he paused just long enough to survey the landscape below. Rolling hills stretched out in every direction, dense patches of trees covering much of the valley. But beyond the wilderness, in the far distance, a narrow dirt road snaked along the base of the hills, a way out. Marcus descended carefully, every step placed with precision to avoid losing his footing. He slid down small slopes, his boots dislodging loose stones that tumbled ahead of him. The damp soil softened his steps, but his focus never wavered. He was moving toward that road. It was his lifeline, his escape, his first step toward getting his plane back. He knew Derek and his men thought they had left him broken and beaten, but they had underestimated the wrong man. By dusk, Marcus reached the dirt road. He fell into a steady pace, each footfall driven by purpose. His body ached, his muscles stiff from the long trek, But his mind was already racing ahead. He was building his plan, tracking every move he would make to hunt those men down. He would get his plane back. He would take down every last one of them. After another mile, he spotted a flicker of headlights in the distance. A beat-up pickup truck approached, its engine growling low as it navigated the uneven path. Marcus stepped into the open, raising his hand, his face calm despite the storm inside him. The driver slowed. An older man, face weathered, eyes cautious as they swept over Marcus. "You all right, son?" the man asked, concern laced in his voice. Marcus forced a small smile, hiding the fire burning beneath his exterior. "Had a bit of an accident. Need a ride back toward town. Got a phone?" The man gave a small nod. "Yeah, hop in." Marcus climbed into the truck, his muscles stiff, but his mind sharp. He took the phone the moment it was offered, dialing swiftly. Chloe picked up on the third ring. "Marcus, you're early. What's—" "I need you to listen." Marcus cut in, his voice low and steady. "They took it. The plane. They took it." Silence hung on the line for a beat, thick with tension. Then Chloe's voice sharpened, her usual easy tone replaced with something hard and urgent. "What? Who?" Marcus cut her off before she could get lost in questions he didn't have time to answer. "Later," he said, his voice firm, clipped. "I need you to start digging. Look for anything unusual at the small strips around here. Cash flights, low-profile takeoffs. They won't take it to a major hub. Not yet." He heard her breathing quicken on the other end, concern mixing with the gears of her mind already turning. She was sharp, efficient, the kind of person who solved problems before others even realized there was one. That was why he trusted her. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice softening slightly. Marcus shifted in his seat, feeling the stiffness in his muscles, the ache settling into his limbs from the hours of climbing and walking. His throat still burned from Derek's grip, and his ribs throbbed from Tyrell's rough handling. But none of that mattered. "I'm breathing," he replied. "That's enough. For now." He leaned back in the worn seat of the truck, exhaustion dragging at him like a weight. But he shoved it aside. He couldn't afford to slow down. Chloe would move fast. She always did. She was the kind of person who could rebuild an entire engine with duct tape and determination if it meant getting a plane back in the air. He needed her now more than ever. The truck jolted over another bump, the dirt road giving way to something smoother as they neared town. Marcus's gaze drifted out the window, but his thoughts were elsewhere, back to his Air Force days, back to another time when everything had gone wrong. He thought of the mission over hostile territory when his engine was shot out mid-flight. He had glided over enemy lines with nothing but grit and training keeping him from slamming into the sand below. He remembered the heat of the desert, the isolation, and the long march back to safety, with enemy patrols lurking nearby. He had been stranded before, but he had made it back. He always made it back. Derek and his crew thought they had stolen from a civilian, a pilot who flew charter planes to pay the bills, someone they could muscle and discard. They didn't know who they had really crossed. They had declared war on a man who had flown under fire, who had stared death in the face, and lived to talk about it. And Marcus Steele had no intention of losing this battle. The pickup finally hit the paved road, the smooth hum beneath the tires pulling Marcus back into the present. He straightened in his seat, his eyes narrowing with renewed focus. This wasn't over. It was just getting started. He pressed the phone back to his ear. "Chloe." "Yeah?" Her voice was ready, determined. "Get ready. We're taking it back." By the time Marcus Steele rolled into town under the pale morning sun, his body ached, but his mind was clear. Rest could wait. His plane and those men would not. He had Chloe meet him at a small auto shop she sometimes worked out of, a place off the radar, where questions weren't asked if you paid in cash. The kind of place Derek's crew might use themselves. The garage door was half open when Marcus arrived, the clink of tools and the faint buzz of a radio humming from inside. Chloe Ramirez stood over a stripped-down engine, wiping her hands on a rag, her face set in a scowl that barely hid her worry. "You look like hell," she said, her eyes scanning him for injuries. Marcus stepped inside, his gaze sharp but calm. "Feel worse," he admitted. "But we don't have time to talk about that." Chloe tossed the rag aside. "I've been pulling what I can. I made a few calls to some mechanics and strip operators. Nothing definite yet. But I heard about a few flights leaving out of a private field near the foothills. Cash jobs, no logs. Could be them." Marcus nodded. "That's the kind of place they'd use. They won't risk the plane near a commercial airport." Chloe leaned against the workbench, arms crossed. "You sure about this, Marcus? These guys don't sound like small-time smugglers. You come at them. It's not just about the plane anymore. It's about sending a message. You ready for that?" Marcus's eyes hardened. "They made their move. Now I'm making mine." She sighed, but didn't argue. She knew Marcus. Knew his resolve when he set his mind to something. The same determination that made him a trusted pilot was what kept him alive through his military years. "We need intel," Marcus continued. "The kind you and I can't get just by asking around." Chloe paused, then gave a reluctant nod. "I know someone. Mitch, ex-customs guy. He keeps tabs on off-the-books flights, favors for cash. He won't talk easy, though." Marcus remembered Mitch, a hard-drinking veteran who had been forced out of his position after a smuggling bust went wrong. He was useful, but unpredictable. Marcus didn't like depending on men like him, but this wasn't about preference. It was about necessity. "Set it up," Marcus said, "today." A few hours later, Marcus and Chloe found Mitch nursing a cup of coffee at a roadside diner, his wrinkled face half hidden beneath a cap. His eyes darted around the room even when he wasn't speaking, a man who had seen too much and trusted too little. "Mitch," Marcus greeted, sliding into the booth across from him. Chloe sat beside Marcus, her arms folded. Mitch squinted. "Steel. Heard you went clean after the service. Guess that didn't last." Marcus didn't rise to the bait. "I need information. Quick. A citation jet. Flown off a remote strip yesterday. No manifest. Likely dirty cargo. You know anything?" Mitch scratched his cheek, pretending to think. But Marcus could see the calculation behind his eyes. He wasn't weighing his memory. He was weighing the price. "Information costs," Mitch said finally. Marcus leaned in. "And loyalty costs more. I'm not buying silence, I'm buying results." Mitch's eyes lingered on him, then shifted to Chloe, who stared him down with the same steel in her gaze. He grunted. "There's been talk. A plane like that, new face moving product across the state line. Quick hops, no attention. Sounds like your bird." Marcus's chest tightened. "Where? Last I heard? South Ridge Airstrip. Old mining site. Private. Used to be dust runners moving contraband. Now it's something bigger. Security's tight. Not the kind you bribe. They shoot first." Chloe's jaw clenched. "They moving the plane soon?" Mitch shrugged. "Could be today. Tomorrow. They don't let things sit long. That plane's their prize now." Marcus's fists tightened under the table. He had expected this, but hearing it confirmed turned the knife. His plane, his freedom, was being used as a tool for criminals. He slid a few bills across the table. Mitch pocketed them without a word. "We were never here," Marcus said. Mitch nodded, his eyes flicking to the door as though he was already planning his exit. Back outside, Chloe turned to Marcus. "If we go there, we won't be asking nicely." Marcus's voice was low, steady. "I'm not interested in asking." They stood by her truck for a moment, the tension between them growing heavier. "This isn't just about the plane, is it?" Chloe asked finally. Marcus's gaze drifted toward the horizon. "No, it's about making sure men like Derek don't get to win." Chloe gave a slow nod. "Then we go in together." Marcus looked at her, gratitude in his eyes. He didn't say it. He didn't need to. They climbed into the truck, the sun beginning to set behind the hills. The path ahead was dangerous. The men they were up against wouldn't back down. But Marcus had flown through worse storms, and this time he wasn't coming alone. The truck rattled over the uneven back road as dusk settled over the hills. Chloe Ramirez gripped the wheel, her eyes locked on the winding path ahead. Marcus Steele sat beside her, silent, his gaze fixed on the horizon. They had the location now, South Ridge Airstrip. That was where Derek and his crew were holding his plane. But knowing was only half the battle. The other half was getting it back, and Marcus was beginning to feel the weight of that reality. "You're too quiet," Chloe said finally, her voice cutting through the hum of the engine. "I know that look. What's going on in your head?" Marcus shifted in his seat, arms crossed, jaw tight. He debated brushing her off with something light, but he knew better. Chloe saw through that. She always had. "I'm thinking about what happens when we get there," he admitted. "This isn't some handshake deal gone wrong. These men, Derek, they're not going to let us walk in and fly the plane out. They'll fight." "And you're ready for that?" Chloe replied. It wasn't a question. Marcus exhaled slowly. "I am. But that's the problem. I know exactly what I'm capable of when the fight starts." He paused, his voice lowering. "I haven't had to be that man in a long time. The man I was over there, during deployments." He didn't hesitate. He did what had to be done. "And when you come home, they tell you to turn that off. Be normal. Fit in. But it never really turns off, Chloe." Her hands tightened on the steering wheel, but she didn't interrupt. She knew he needed to say this. "I don't want to lose control," Marcus continued. "But if it's between me and them, I know how far I'll go. I just don't know if I'll be able to come back from it this time." Silence filled the cabin for a few moments, broken only by the crunch of gravel under the tires. Then Chloe spoke, her voice softer but firm. "You think I don't get it? I've seen what that kind of anger can do. My brother, he had it. Came back from his third tour, and he wasn't the same. Got into fights. Drinking. Couldn't find his way back. We lost him, Marcus. But you're not him. You're here. You're thinking about this before it happens. That's the difference." Marcus turned to her, her words hitting harder than he expected. He had known about her brother, but they had never talked about it like this. The pain in her eyes was still fresh, even after all these years. "I'm not letting you go through that again," Marcus said quietly. She glanced at him, her eyes narrowing. "Good, because I'm not letting you get yourself killed either. We do this together. Or not at all. You don't run off and play hero." Marcus gave a small nod, the tension in his chest easing slightly. He trusted Chloe with his life. He always had. But this was different. This wasn't just about getting his plane back. It was about making sure he didn't lose himself in the process. The truck crested a ridge, revealing the faint outline of South Ridge Airstrip in the valley below. It was still several miles off, but the sight of it made Marcus's pulse quicken. His plane was down there. So were the men who had stolen it. Chloe slowed the truck, pulling off onto a narrow dirt path obscured by brush. She killed the engine, and they sat there for a moment, surveying the landscape. "We can't just walk in," she said. "They'll see us coming from a mile away." "I know," Marcus said. His mind was already running through the possibilities. "We need to watch, see their patterns, find out how many guards they've got, when they switch shifts, where the weak spots are." Chloe nodded, but there was a hint of unease in her eyes. "And when we do? What's the plan, Marcus? Are we taking the plane and running? Or are we handling them?" Marcus's gaze darkened. He wanted his plane back, but more than that, he wanted Derek to pay. He wanted Tyrell to feel that same helplessness he had forced onto Marcus in the cockpit. He wanted to break the grip these men had on his life, permanently. But Chloe's question hung in the air. How far was he willing to go? "We get the plane," Marcus said finally. "If they stand down, they walk away. If they don't," he let the words hang. But the meaning was clear. Chloe studied him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she reached across and squeezed his hand. "Just remember, you're not alone in this. I'm here. You don't have to carry it all yourself." Marcus squeezed her hand back, grateful for her strength. It grounded him, reminded him of who he was before the uniform, before the anger. Together, they stepped out of the truck and moved toward the ridge, their eyes on the distant airstrip. The storm was coming, but Marcus Steele would face it. On his terms, Marcus Steele lay flat against the dry earth, the cool night air brushing against his face as he peered through a pair of binoculars. From the ridge above South Ridge Airstrip, he had a clear view of the operation below. Floodlights illuminated the makeshift runway, casting long shadows over the gravel and rusted hangar. His plane sat there, his Cessna Citation, gleaming under the artificial light like a caged bird. But what troubled him more was the movement around it. Derek's men were not just guarding the plane, they were preparing it. Cargo crates were being loaded onto a second, smaller aircraft, while two armed men patrolled near the Citation. Terrell stood by the nose of Marcus's plane, speaking animatedly with Raymond, their body language tight and anxious. Derek was nowhere in sight, but Marcus knew he was close. Chloe Ramirez lay beside Marcus, her breathing steady, but her tension palpable. She had her camera with a telephoto lens, snapping discreet photos of the operation below. Every shutter click was quiet, but the stakes made it feel thunderous. "They're running something big," she whispered, lowering the camera. "This isn't small-time smuggling. This is organized." Marcus kept his eyes trained on the runway. "They're moving fast. They know what they have, and they're not wasting time." Chloe exhaled slowly, shifting to her side. "They're arming themselves, too. See that guy by the crates? That's not a sidearm for show. That's a rifle." Marcus had noticed. The presence of heavy weapons changed everything. This wasn't just a gang hijacking a plane. It was something far more dangerous. They were gearing up for violence. "We don't have the luxury of waiting," Marcus said, his voice low but certain. "If they get airborne with that cargo and my plane, we might not see it again." Chloe bit her lip, weighing his words. "But going in tonight? That's risky. We don't know how many are inside that hangar. If we push too soon, we could both end up dead." Marcus adjusted his position, his muscles taut. "We'll watch until their guard drops. But the moment we see an opening, we move." They continued their vigil as the hours stretched on. The activity below fluctuated. Bursts of movement followed by lulls. Derek eventually emerged from the hangar, walking with his usual calculated stride. He spoke briefly with Tyrell, gesturing toward the crates. Even from this distance, Marcus recognized the posture of a man giving final orders. Suddenly, a loud burst of laughter erupted near the rear of the hangar. A few of the guards had gathered around a crate, passing a bottle between them. The tension seemed to break, at least for some of them. "There," Marcus muttered, nudging Chloe. "That's our gap." Chloe adjusted the focus on her camera, zooming in. "Looks like they're getting comfortable." "That's good for us," Marcus nodded. But his mind raced through the variables. He needed to get to the plane. Fast, quiet, and if anyone got in his way, he had already made peace with what that meant. Chloe whispered, "You sure about this?" Marcus's eyes never left his plane. "I didn't come all this way to lose." They waited until the guards drifted further from the Citation, lulled by drink and fatigue. Marcus noted that Tyrell had stepped inside the hangar, while Derek had disappeared from view. That was their window. "Let's go," Marcus breathed. They moved swiftly but carefully, weaving through the brush toward the edge of the airstrip. Each step was calculated. Each breath was measured. Marcus's heart pounded, but his focus was razor-sharp. They stopped behind a stack of fuel drums near the hangar. Marcus peered around the corner, spotting the plane less than 30 feet away. The two remaining guards were leaning against a truck, their conversation lazy. Marcus turned to Chloe. "Cover me from here. If it goes south, get back to the ridge. Don't wait for me." Her eyes hardened. "I'm not leaving you." He didn't argue. There was no time. Marcus crept toward the plane, his footsteps muffled by the gravel. He kept low, using the shadow of the aircraft to mask his approach. His fingers brushed against the fuselage. His plane, his freedom. But as he reached for the door handle, a voice sliced through the night. "Hey!" Marcus froze. One of the guards had spotted movement. Before he could react, the other guard was already raising his weapon. Chloe's voice whispered sharply in Marcus's earpiece. "Marcus, stay put!" he hissed. The guard advanced cautiously, flashlight cutting through the dark. Marcus gritted his teeth. He had seconds before everything spiraled out of control. He needed to make those seconds count. Marcus Steele pressed his back against the cool metal of his plane's fuselage, his breath shallow, eyes fixed on the approaching guard's flashlight beam. Each step the man took kicked up small clouds of dust, the crunch of gravel under his boots sounding deafening in the still night air. The barrel of the rifle glinted under the floodlights as it swept the shadows. Marcus knew he was seconds away from being seen. He slid carefully along the plane's side, keeping low. A few more inches, and he reached the rear landing gear. He lowered himself flat to the ground, pressed against the wheel assembly, and held his breath. The guard's beam passed over the side of the aircraft, but missed the narrow space beneath it. "Anything?" the other guard called from a few yards away. "Nah. Thought I saw something. Probably a coyote. Or you're seeing things. Lay off the whiskey, man." The tension in Marcus's chest released slightly, as the guard cursed under his breath and turned back toward the truck. He lingered a moment longer before retreating fully. Marcus stayed still for another minute, long enough to be sure, before inching back toward the cover of the fuel drums where Chloe was hidden. Her eyes were wide with concern as he crouched beside her. "That was close," she whispered. "Too close," Marcus muttered. "We pull back." They slipped away into the dark, climbing the ridge in silence until they reached the truck. Only when they were inside, doors closed and engine off, did Marcus allow himself a full breath. "We won't get another clean shot like that," Chloe said, gripping the steering wheel. "They'll tighten up after tonight." Marcus nodded slowly, his mind already moving forward. "We need a new approach. We're not sneaking in. We're walking in." Chloe frowned. "What are you thinking?" Marcus leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "I'm going to make contact. Pose as a buyer. They're moving product, right? That means they're looking for customers. We get inside their operation, we get closer to the plane." Chloe's expression hardened. "That's risky, Marcus. You get made, they won't hesitate." "They won't make me," Marcus said. "Not if we do it right." The next morning, Marcus made a call to Mitch, the former customs agent who had tipped them off about South Ridge. It took money, and more than a few promises, but by the end of the conversation, Marcus had a name and an introduction. The gang called themselves the Vance Group. Low profile, but dangerous. Drug running, arms smuggling, anything with profit and minimal traceability. They operated under the radar, moving cargo across state lines by air. Derek was more than muscle. He was their linchpin pilot, making the runs possible with skilled flying and ruthless control. "They vet buyers hard," Mitch warned over the phone. "Don't show weakness. Don't overplay your hand. If you flinch, they'll smell it." Marcus understood. He had faced harder men in uniform. By midday, Marcus stood in front of a warehouse office on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, corrugated metal walls, a few trucks parked along the side, but there was power in its simplicity, the kind of place where bodies could disappear and no one would ask questions. He adjusted his stance, straightening his shoulders. He was no longer Marcus Steele, private pilot. Today, he was Marcus Hayes, an independent operator looking to run product across borders. No questions asked. A man in a dark jacket met him at the door. His eyes were cold and calculating. "You, Marcus?" "Hayes," Marcus corrected. "I'm here because I heard you work fast." The man studied him, then nodded toward the office. "Follow me." Inside, Marcus's pulse slowed, his mind slipping into the controlled clarity he had relied on in the military. He was in the enemy's space now. One wrong word, one nervous twitch, and it was over. Derek was not present, but Tyrell was. Marcus recognized him instantly, standing near the back, arms crossed. His face was etched with suspicion, and Marcus's appearance didn't go unnoticed. Their eyes met briefly, too briefly for Tyrell to place him, but Marcus knew the danger was real. If Tyrell pieced it together, he wouldn't leave that room alive. A different man, older and thinner, conducted the meeting. He asked questions, blunt, transactional. What cargo? What destinations? How soon? Marcus kept his answers crisp, but confident. He claimed to have contacts across the border, clients willing to pay for speed and silence. Terrell moved closer during the exchange, his eyes narrowing. "You look familiar," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. Marcus met his gaze without flinching. "I get that a lot. I work around airfields." Faces blurred together. Tyrell's eyes lingered. "Yeah? What field?" Marcus rattled off an airport name 2 states over, one he had flown out of during his Air Force years. His tone was so casual, so certain, that it planted just enough doubt. Tyrell seemed to weigh it before giving a faint grunt and stepping back. The tension in the room eased, but Marcus knew it was far from over. The meeting concluded with an agreement. An introductory run in 2 days. Marcus would transport a small load as proof of competence. After that, bigger jobs, the kind Derek's crew valued. Marcus left the office with a handshake, but his mind was already racing. He had secured his way into their network, but he had also placed himself in their crosshairs. Terrell would not let his suspicion fade. And when Derek found out, Marcus would need to be ready. Marcus Steele sat behind the wheel of his truck, parked at the edge of a truck stop lot, eyes locked on the silhouette of Southridge Airstrip in the distance. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the sky was fading into a bruised purple. His hands rested on the steering wheel, but his mind was racing, processing every detail from the meeting earlier that day. Marcus had kept his head down during the meeting, careful not to overplay his hand. He had stayed in his role, Marcus Hayes, the smuggler looking for quick flights. But when the conversation shifted toward the shipment, his blood had run cold. Weapons, not handguns or street-level firearms, military-grade cargo, automatic rifles, tactical gear, and crates that suggested something heavier. Marcus had seen enough in his time overseas to recognize that kind of preparation. This was a supply run for violence, and his plane was set to carry it. The shipment was scheduled to leave tomorrow night. If it took off, the plane would be gone, repainted, re-registered, and folded permanently into the gang's smuggling network. Marcus wouldn't see it again. Worse, he knew what would happen if those weapons hit the streets. He had seen the aftermath before. Innocents caught in the crossfire, families shattered. Failure wasn't an option. He started the truck and drove toward the diner where Chloe was waiting. He found her in the same booth they had been using for days. A map of the region spread across the table, her coffee untouched. Marcus slid in across from her, his face giving away the severity before he even spoke. "What happened?" she asked quietly. Marcus leaned in, lowering his voice. "Weapons. Big shipment. They're loading it onto my plane tomorrow night." Chloe's expression darkened. "That fast?" Marcus nodded. "Tyrell's running it. Derek's still in the shadows, but Tyrell's leading the charge." She absorbed the information, her jaw tight. "If they get in the air, we lose the plane. And those guns hit the streets," Marcus cut in. "We can't let that happen." Chloe leaned back, her fingers tapping lightly on the table. "We don't have time to plan this out properly." "You're thinking we hit them tomorrow?" Marcus's eyes were cold with resolve. "Before they get airborne. We hit them during the load-up. That's when they're vulnerable." She exhaled slowly. "And if Tyrell recognizes you?" Marcus's jaw tensed. "Then we finish this." Chloe stared at him for a long moment. "We need a way to scatter them. Fast." Marcus glanced down at the map she had marked with the airstrip layout. His eyes landed on the fuel drums they had seen near the hangar. "The fuel depot. If we set off a controlled blast, it'll force them to evacuate. At least long enough for us to move." Chloe raised an eyebrow. "Controlled, huh?" Marcus allowed the faintest smile. "Air Force training wasn't just about flying." She nodded. "What's our exit plan?" Marcus's expression hardened. "We fly the plane out." Chloe let that sink in. "If it's fueled and ready for the shipment, that could work. But we need keys, and we need to make sure no one can follow us." Marcus leaned in. "We disable their other plane, slit the tires, break the hydraulics. If we take the Citation, they won't get off the ground to chase us." The plan was desperate, reckless even, but it was all they had. Chloe folded her arms. "And Terrell?" Marcus's voice dropped lower, his eyes narrowing. "If he stands down, he walks away." If he doesn't? Chloe held his gaze. We don't get to undo this if it goes that far. Marcus nodded slowly. I know. Silence settled over the table, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on both of them. Finally, Chloe broke it. We'll need more than wire cutters. Explosives. Disabling hydraulics? You're talking sabotage. Marcus's mind was already there. We get what we need tonight. Tools. Accelerants. I'll handle the ignition setup for the fuel. Chloe's lips pressed together, but she gave a firm nod. I'll get us into the hangar. You worry about getting us out. They left the diner together, the night air cool against their faces. Marcus glanced toward the ridge in the distance. His plane was down there, prepped to carry death. But not if he got there first. This was it. One night, one shot. Either he reclaimed his plane, or he didn't come back. The night air was heavier than usual as Marcus Steele crouched behind the tree line overlooking South Ridge Airstrip. Chloe was beside him, her breathing measured, eyes locked on the cluster of men preparing the shipment below. Their plan had taken shape quickly, faster than either of them liked. But time wasn't a luxury they could afford. The gang was moving the weapons tonight. If that plane left, it would vanish into their smuggling pipeline, and Marcus's last chance to reclaim it would be gone. From their vantage point, they could see Tyrell barking orders near the hangar. He was tense, his movements sharper than usual. He paced back and forth between the crates of firearms being loaded onto the second aircraft. Marcus noted the shift in the group's energy. They were on edge, likely aware that this shipment was more valuable than their usual runs. The fuel depot was just beyond the hangar, a stack of drums standing in neat rows. It was their key to disruption. Marcus had rigged a small ignition charge to one of the drums earlier that evening, under the cover of gathering dusk. He had worked fast but precise, slipping between shadows while Chloe created a diversion near the perimeter to pull one of the guards away. The charge wasn't enough to destroy the airstrip, just a flash, a boom, and a burst of flame. It would create panic. That was all they needed. Now, the waiting gnawed at Marcus's patience. He checked his watch. 5 minutes until their planned detonation. Once the blast went off, they would move. Chloe would disable the other aircraft's tires with a blade hidden in her boot, while Marcus would reach the citation. If everything went smoothly, they would be airborne before the gang could regroup. But Marcus knew better than to expect smooth. He exhaled, his gaze narrowing on Tyrell. The man looked more irritable than ever, his head swiveling occasionally as if expecting something to go wrong. Marcus could tell. Tyrell's suspicion from their last meeting hadn't faded. It had grown. Marcus whispered, "We hit the fuel. You take out their plane. You get 20 seconds. That's it." Chloe gave a small nod, her eyes sharp. She understood the stakes. They had rehearsed it in whispers all afternoon. Any longer, and they would both be caught in the inevitable gunfire. Marcus pressed the small remote detonator into his palm, his thumb hovering over the button. He counted silently. 3, 2, 1. He pressed it. The explosion was louder than he expected. A sharp crack echoed through the valley, followed by a fireball that leapt into the night sky. Heat waves distorted the air, and the shadows of men scurried in panic. Shouts erupted from the hangar. Weapons were drawn, but no one knew where to aim. Tyrell spun, his voice cutting through the confusion, but his orders were lost in the chaos. Marcus seized the moment. "Go!" he hissed. He and Chloe moved as one, splitting in opposite directions. Marcus sprinted toward the citation, keeping low, using the flickering flames to mask his approach. The scent of burning fuel filled his lungs, but adrenaline drowned out the discomfort. He reached the plane's door and grabbed the handle. Locked, of course. He grit his teeth. He had expected this. His eyes flicked back to the crowd near the hangar. Tyrell was barking commands, his face twisted with fury. Raymond was nearby, rallying 2 others toward the flames. But it was Derek's sudden appearance that froze Marcus in place. Derek hadn't been seen for days, but now he was here, walking with a predator's calmness. His eyes swept over the airstrip, assessing the situation. And then, as if pulled by instinct, his gaze drifted toward the citation. Marcus ducked behind the plane's wing, cursing under his breath. Derek was too sharp. He saw patterns others missed. He would know this wasn't an accident. Marcus scanned for Chloe. She was crouched near the other aircraft, slashing its tires with swift precision. But Derek was already moving in her direction. Marcus made a choice. He stepped out from behind the wing, his voice cutting through the night. "Derek!" The name halted the older man in his tracks. Tyrell snapped his head toward the voice, his eyes narrowing as recognition dawned. "You," Tyrell growled. Marcus raised his hands slowly, his heart racing, but his face unreadable. He had their attention, exactly what he wanted. Derek approached, his expression calm but deadly. "Steele," he greeted with quiet menace. "Didn't think we'd see you again." Marcus took a step forward, his stance strong. "You took my plane. I came to take it back." Tyrell's hand drifted toward his waistband. Marcus saw the tension in his fingers, the hunger to finish what he had started days before. Derek, however, raised a hand, stopping him. "Not yet." Marcus didn't break eye contact. He was buying Chloe time. That was all he needed. "You made a mistake, Steele," Derek said softly. "You should have stayed gone." Marcus's pulse thudded in his ears, but his voice stayed steady. "Or maybe you made a mistake thinking I'd let you keep what's mine." The standoff stretched, seconds feeling like hours. Then, from the corner of his eye, Marcus saw Chloe slipping into position near the rear of the Citation. That was his cue. "Let's finish this," Marcus said. Derek's eyes flickered, calculating. And then everything snapped. Tyrell drew his weapon. Marcus moved. Tyrell's hand snapped to his waistband, fingers curling around the grip of his pistol. Marcus Steele lunged forward before the weapon cleared the holster, driving his shoulder into Tyrell's chest with the force of years spent in military drills. The air burst from Tyrell's lungs in a guttural gasp as he stumbled backward, his hand loosening for a brief second. But that second was all Marcus needed. He seized Tyrell's wrist and twisted it sharply, forcing the gun to clatter onto the gravel. Derek's voice cut through the confusion like a blade. "Stop him!" Marcus didn't wait. He drove his elbow into Tyrell's jaw, sending him sprawling onto the ground, before darting toward the Citation's door. His chest heaved, adrenaline surging through every vein. He could hear the shouts behind him. Derek barking orders, Raymond rallying the others. Footsteps pounded on the gravel as more men scrambled from the hangar, drawn by the explosion, and now the fight. Marcus gripped the plane's door handle and yanked, but it was still locked. His heart hammered in his ears as he scanned the underbelly of the aircraft. Chloe had slipped around the other side. He caught a brief flash of her shadow as she worked furiously to breach the maintenance hatch near the rear. Gunfire cracked behind him. A warning shot, close enough to kick up dust near his boots. "Don't move!" Derek's voice, low and commanding, cut through the night. Marcus turned slowly, raising his hands halfway, palms open. Derek stood 10 yards away, pistol steady in his grip. His face was calm, too calm, but his eyes burned with something deeper. Control, power, the belief that this was still his field, his game. Tyrell was on his knees, blood trickling from his lip, his face twisted with rage. He reached for his gun, but Derek stopped him with a glance. "Not yet?" Derek said quietly. "Steele's smarter than that." Marcus's breath slowed as he evaluated his surroundings. Chloe was still hidden, but her absence was a thin thread. If they spotted her, everything collapsed. He needed to hold their attention. "You think this is over?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying more steadiness than he felt. "You're wrong." Derek tilted his head slightly, the faintest trace of amusement in his eyes. "You don't get it, Steele. It's already over. You lost the moment you let us take the plane." Marcus's lips pressed into a thin line. He took a careful step forward, reading every twitch in Derek's stance. "You're wrong about that, too. You stole metal and engines. But this plane, it's mine. Not because I own it, because I flew it, because I know every sound it makes, every quirk in its controls. You can fly it anywhere you want, but it'll never be yours." Tyrell spat onto the ground. Big talk from a man standing in the dirt with nothing. Marcus's gaze snapped to him. eyes cold. I had nothing before, and I survived. Derek's finger twitched near the trigger. He was losing patience. Marcus could see it. The desire to end this cleanly, to snuff out the problem and carry on with the shipment. Men like Derek hated loose ends. Behind them, the flicker of flames from the fuel drums painted the night in orange hues. The smell of gasoline still hung thick in the air. Marcus's mind raced. He needed a shift. A crack in their formation. He found it. "You're bleeding cash right now," Marcus said, his voice low, cutting. "That shipment's stalled. Your guards are scattered. You've got a plane with sabotaged hydraulics. You think you're in control, but you're not. I just grounded your whole operation." Derek's jaw tightened. His eyes darted, briefly, toward the other aircraft, the one Chloe had disabled. That was all Marcus needed. Marcus moved. He dropped low, snatching up a fist-sized stone from the ground and hurled it toward Derek's face. It wasn't meant to hurt. It was meant to disrupt. Derek flinched, his aim wavering. In that instant, Marcus closed the distance. His hand clamped around Derek's wrist, forcing the gun aside. Derek was strong, stronger than Marcus expected. But Marcus fought like a man with nothing to lose. He drove his knee into Derek's ribs and twisted the gun hand until Derek's fingers gave out. The pistol hit the ground. Tyrell charged. Marcus saw him too late. The younger man tackled him, slamming him into the side of the plane. Pain shot through Marcus's shoulder, but he stayed on his feet. He threw an elbow into Tyrell's ribs. Once, twice, before breaking free. Derek was back up, breathing hard, his eyes murderous. Enough! Marcus braced himself, fists clenched. He was outnumbered. If they swarmed him, it was over. But before Derek could give the order, Chloe emerged from the other side of the plane, holding a wrench like a weapon. "I cut the fuel lines!" she shouted. "You fire a shot here, you'll all go up with us." Everyone froze. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Marcus saw Derek's mind turning, calculating risk, cost, consequence. For the first time, Marcus saw doubt creep into the man's eyes. "This plane's leaving with me," Marcus said, his voice firm. "Or none of us are leaving at all." Derek's jaw tightened. Tyrell seethed beside him, fists shaking. Then, slowly, Derek stepped back. "This isn't over, Steele," he said, his voice a low growl. "Not by a long shot." Marcus didn't blink. "We'll see." Chloe slipped into the cockpit, and Marcus followed. He didn't break eye contact with Derek until the door closed. The engines roared to life. The runway was clear. The men outside didn't dare shoot. As the plane lifted off, Marcus glanced down one last time. Derek stood in the firelight, still watching. But Marcus was free, and his plane was his again. For now, the vibration of the engines beneath Marcus Steele's hands was a familiar comfort, but there was no time to relish it. His knuckles were tight against the throttle as the Cessna Citation surged forward down the rough makeshift runway. The gravel surface was uneven, causing the plane to jolt with every bump, but Marcus held steady, eyes sharp, instincts from his military days guiding him through every second. Beside him, Chloe Ramirez sat in the co-pilot seat, scanning the gauges and switches. Her breathing was quick but controlled. She trusted Marcus, but they both knew the danger hadn't passed. The plane was moving, but they were far from safe. Through the cockpit windows, Marcus saw Derek and Tyrell rushing back toward the second aircraft. Even from a distance, Marcus could see Tyrell's rage as he slammed a hand on the fuselage, discovering what Chloe had done. Derek was already giving orders, pointing toward a black SUV parked near the hangar. Their aircraft was disabled, but they weren't giving up. They were preparing to follow by ground. "They're coming," Chloe muttered, her eyes flicking to the side mirror that gave a partial view of the strip behind them. Marcus kept his voice calm, though his chest burned with adrenaline. "Let them try. We're getting off this dirt patch." He eased back on the yoke, and the plane's nose lifted. The landing gear strained over the final stretch of uneven ground before the aircraft finally broke free, lifting into the cool night sky. Marcus exhaled through his nose, but he didn't relax. There was no room for that. "Gear up," he said. Chloe adjusted the controls, the soft hum of the wheels retracting into place beneath them. Marcus climbed fast, banking the plane sharply to the left to put distance between them and the airstrip. His eyes flicked to the fuel gauge, calculating their margin. The sabotaged lines had cost them. They had enough for this flight, but not for mistakes. Below, the SUV's headlights flared to life, tearing across the dirt road that snaked along the valley. Marcus knew where it led. There was a stretch of open highway parallel to his flight path. Derek was determined, and desperate men were dangerous. Chloe tapped the side window with her knuckle. "They're racing us, probably thinking we'll land nearby to refuel." Marcus's jaw tensed. He could almost feel Derek's anger from the cockpit. The man didn't just want the plane, he wanted retribution. Marcus had humiliated him, undermined his operation, and shattered his image of control. He wouldn't stop, but neither would Marcus. "We don't give them the chance," Marcus said. His voice was low, but there was an edge to it now. "We lead them out, farther than they want to go." He adjusted their heading, angling the plane toward the rocky canyons that carved through the region. Terrain only experienced pilots dared navigate. The winding valleys and sudden gusts were dangerous, but Marcus knew every turn. He had flown these skies during low-altitude drills in the Air Force. Derek? He was stuck on the ground. "They're not getting that plane back," Marcus muttered. "They're not getting anything." The plane dipped into the canyons, weaving through narrow gaps. Chloe gripped her seat, eyes wide but trusting. The aircraft skimmed close to the rock walls, Marcus's steady hands guiding it with precision. He was pushing the limits of the plane and himself, but he knew this was his advantage. Below, the SUV was falling behind. The rugged terrain slowed them down, and Marcus could see their headlights flickering as they struggled to keep pace along the narrow dirt paths. "They can't keep up," Chloe said, breathless. Marcus didn't answer. He was focused on the final stretch, an S-shaped pass notorious for its sudden crosswinds. It had been the site of more than one crash over the years, but to Marcus, it was a familiar challenge. He entered the pass, the plane dipping slightly as the wind slammed against it. Marcus compensated, adjusting the throttle and rudder with precision. The walls of the canyon seemed to close in, but he held his course. This was his sky. The SUV's headlights disappeared behind a bend, then reappeared briefly, fainter, slower. Marcus knew they were losing their nerve. The speed he was forcing them to maintain on treacherous roads was a risk they hadn't expected. And then it happened. Derek pushed too hard. Marcus watched from above as the SUV attempted to round a sharp corner at high speed. The tires caught loose gravel, and the vehicle skidded violently. For a moment, it teetered on the edge of the canyon wall, and then it tipped. The headlights spiraled downward, twisting, tumbling, until they vanished in a burst of sparks and a heavy crash. Chloe gasped, leaning closer to the window. "Marcus, they went over." Marcus's eyes remained forward. His grip on the yoke tightened, but his face was unreadable. He had expected this, perhaps even counted on it. Men like Derek always pushed too far. They couldn't handle losing. He banked the plane into a slow climb, leaving the canyon below in darkness. Chloe exhaled softly. "Do we check?" Marcus's jaw twitched, but his voice was steady. "No, it's over." They flew in silence for several miles, the adrenaline slowly fading, replaced by exhaustion. Marcus kept his eyes on the horizon, but he felt the weight lifting from his chest. He had his plane, he had his life, and Derek was gone. The storm had passed. The sun was breaking over the horizon as Marcus Steele eased the Citation down onto the smooth asphalt of the small regional airstrip he called home. The familiar runway stretched before him like a promise kept. The landing gear kissed the ground gently, the plane rolling forward until it settled to a stop. For the first time in days, Marcus let his grip on the yoke relax. The hum of the engines faded into a low idle, and he exhaled slowly. Beside him, Chloe Ramirez leaned back in her seat, eyes closed briefly as relief washed over her. The exhaustion was etched into both of their faces, but there was triumph there too. They had made it back, plane intact, lives still their own. Marcus powered down the controls with precision, though his thoughts were far from the familiar routine. As his hands moved over the switches, he replayed the events of the past 48 hours, the hijacking, the threats, the desperate fight, and finally, Derek's SUV tumbling into the canyon below. It was done. Derek's reign over that airstrip was over, and his smuggling pipeline was shattered. But victory left Marcus with an emptiness he hadn't expected. He had won, but it had cost him more than just bruises. It had awakened something within him, something he had buried after leaving the Air Force. The part of him that fought, calculated, and survived by any means necessary. The part that didn't hesitate when he saw the SUV go over the edge. He had let Derek fall, and he didn't regret it. Chloe climbed down from the cockpit, stretching her stiff limbs, but her eyes stayed on Marcus. She knew him well enough to see that the fight hadn't left him completely. "You did what you had to do," she said softly, standing at the base of the steps. Marcus stepped out onto the tarmac, the cool morning air brushing against his face. He looked at his plane, and ran a hand along the fuselage. Scratches from the rough landing at South Ridge still marked the metal, but it was back where it belonged. With him. "Yeah," Marcus replied, his voice low, steady, "but it doesn't feel as good as I thought it would." Chloe leaned against the wing, watching him closely. "Because you're not just a fighter, Marcus. You're a pilot. You don't live for the fight. You live for this." She gestured to the plane, to the sky stretching beyond it. He followed her gaze, and for the first time in days, he felt it again, the freedom that had driven him into the cockpit all those years ago. Flying wasn't about escaping danger. It was about rising above it. Marcus crossed his arms, his gaze steady. "They'll come looking eventually. Maybe not Tyrell, if he even made it out, but someone will pick up the pieces. Operations like theirs don't die easy." Chloe shrugged. "Let them come. We'll be ready." Her confidence brought a small, genuine smile to Marcus's face. He knew she meant it. Whatever came next, they would face it together. She wasn't just his mechanic. She was his partner in every way that mattered. As they walked toward the hangar, Marcus's phone buzzed. He checked the screen. Mitch, the former customs agent who had given them the initial tip. Marcus stepped aside to take the call. "Steele." Mitch's voice came through, gravelly but tinged with curiosity. "Heard some noise about a shipment gone wrong out near South Ridge. Word is, somebody made sure it didn't leave the ground." Marcus's lips tightened. "People hear a lot of things." Mitch chuckled lightly. "Just thought you'd like to know. Law enforcement's sniffing around, but they're chasing shadows. No bodies, no plane, just wreckage, like it never happened." Marcus absorbed the information. Derek's fall would stay buried. For now, it was over, and no one would be coming with badges to his hangar. "Appreciate the update," Marcus said, then ended the call. He turned back to Chloe, who had already begun inspecting the plane's undercarriage, muttering about replacing some parts. Marcus watched her work, feeling the last of the tension drain from his body. They were back to what they did best: flying, fixing, and moving forward. Marcus placed his hand on the plane's nose, feeling the warmth of the rising sun spreading over the metal. This plane had nearly been taken from him. It had been more than just a machine. It had been his freedom, his identity. Taking it back hadn't just been about pride. It had been about reclaiming his life. Chloe wiped grease from her hands and stood up. "So, what now? You take a break? Or you book the next flight?" Marcus chuckled, the sound feeling more natural than it had in days. "Breaks aren't really my thing." She smiled knowingly. "Didn't think so." Marcus looked out at the open sky, clear and wide. He had survived the worst. He had fought back and won. But more than that, he had rediscovered his purpose. He wasn't just a pilot who had been wronged. He was a man who wouldn't let anyone take his future from him. He climbed back up the steps into the cockpit, the familiar feeling of belonging settling over him. Chloe followed, sliding into the co-pilot seat with a smirk. "Where to, Captain?" she asked playfully. Marcus flipped the switches, the engines humming back to life. Anywhere we want. The Citation taxied down the strip, and as the wheels lifted off the ground, Marcus felt it. The freedom, the control, and the certainty that whatever came next, he was ready. Up here, he was untouchable. Marcus Steele reclaimed his plane and his future. His fight wasn't just about metal and engines, it was about freedom. Wherever the skies lead next, Marcus will be there, flying free. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.